that way?
Has to be.
Up that way? You
Well,
would
anybody that's
come
coming
up.
is late, so you've got your, I'll introduce Shannon, you've got the
Yeah.
same agenda I do, so that's a long biography, I don't bother everybody reading that.
Here you go.
All right. Okay. So my name is Shannon Hulse. I work for the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension at Barnstable County and Woods Hole Sea Grant. I am the floodplain specialist. So I'm going to talk today about all things flooding, things that I think will be of interest to you folks here at the LEPC. I'm going to cover some of the basics of flooding and what we can expect in the future, and then a few specific issues that I work with a lot having to do with flooding that I also think will be relevant to you guys. So we'll start with just general flooding on Cape Cod. Also, as I go, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in and ask. I'm happy to have it be an interactive presentation. So to start, these are the floodplains that we have on Cape Cod. So these are mapped by FEMA. These are mapped by the storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. That's what FEMA decided was a reasonable, moderate level to map to. These maps determine floodplain building regulations. They determine who has to have flood insurance, and they're a good general assumption of safety and flood risk. But they are not at all perfect, but this is what most floodplain issues that we deal with are based on. So that's the dark blue, and then the light blue is a lower risk flood zone, but we like to say that we have high risk flood zones, moderate risk flood zones, and then just flood zones. Everywhere is a flood zone because everyone has a risk of flooding because it can rain anywhere, and if it can rain, then we can have flooded basements, we can have flooded roads, we can have drainage systems that were not designed to deal with the types of flooding that we can get with rain. So everybody is in a floodplain. So some things that I want to talk about with flooding that we are very aware of in my office, and that we want folks to be aware of. I know that the town of Falmouth is very aware of sea level rise and coastal resiliency concerns with the Coastal Resiliency Action Committee. So with sea level rise, conveniently we have the tide chart from Woods Hole. This is the existing tide chart. So the black is what we've seen on an annual basis of what the mean tide is. I'm sorry, with storms. So then we can see some different storms here. So this is 1938. We had a whole lot of flooding in 1938. Same with Hurricane Carol. This was Bob. You can see some spikes here. And then these colored lines are the different probabilities of these storms happening. So basically the probability that we'll get this level of flooding. So this blue line is basically, we have a probability of having that level of flooding every single year. And then when we get up here, we have a 1% chance of getting this level of flooding every year. So with sea level rise, with the latest determinations from the state, we're looking at about 2 feet by 2063. And what that looks like is it changes the base of flooding. So it's raising basically sea level. So it's 0, our 0 point is now higher by 2 feet. So if we have a higher by 2 feet, you can see this line that used to be the 10% chance storm is now 100% chance storm. So we have a 100% chance of seeing that level of flooding. And to put it in another perspective, so the 10-year flood turns into a 50%, so the 10% chance flood turns into the 50% chance flood. And we just have a much higher risk of flooding from any storms that we get. Another way to look at this, I don't have a slide for this right now, but the hurricane of record in Boston, or the storm of record in Boston, was the blizzard of '78 until last year, 2018. So in January, you all remember the January storm that we had last year? So we know we had a lot of flooding from that. That set a new record in Boston by 4 inches. The sea level rise between 1978 and 2018 was 4 inches. If we didn't have sea level rise, that storm in 2018 would not have set a new record because it was there was less flooding with that storm than with the '78 blizzard, but because of sea level rise, we saw an equal and just a little bit higher level of flooding. So that's an interesting way to look at it on the ground right here in Boston. some other things that we want to be aware of with flooding. So we're going to also have precipitation increases. These are a little bit hard to see, but basically this is saying that the Northeast is supposed to have a significant increase in precipitation. And this doesn't mean overall precipitation throughout the year. This means specifically when we have heavy rainfall events, we're going to have even more rain in those rainfall events. So unfortunately, it would be nice if it were a little bit more spread out, but it's more rain all at once. And that means that our stormwater systems, they were not designed to handle the kind of flooding that we're going to see during those storms. So our stormwater systems are going to have a harder time managing that rain and that flooding, and we don't have the budgets to retrograde all of the stormwater systems. But we are going to see more flooded roads and potentially more flooded basements. For first responders, more flooded roads means you might not be able to get trucks through there. So this is something that's important to be aware of. Another issue that we're seeing, or that we will see, is a change in future storm activity. So not only do we have sea level rise and changes in precipitation, but we're also likely to see more intense storms. So we're going to have more higher intensity storms, so Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes. So this is specifically looking at tropical storms. This is the one part of the science that's still a little bit imperfect. They're still refining this, but basically we are going to see storms that have more intensity more frequently and coming further north. So whereas right now we really consider a Category 3 storm to be the maximum that we could get here because of our surface water temperatures, because water temperature is what drives these storms. But we may start seeing more intense storms than that. But even with that, we're going to have more of those intense storms, so that one of our WHOI scientists released a paper in 2015 saying that we may need to begin planning for a Category 3 hurricane landfall every decade or so rather than every 100 or 200 years. So that's a really big difference that has a lot of implications in terms of how we manage things and how we plan for risk. So while this isn't happening right now, and we've been lucky so far on the Cape that we haven't seen too many extremely difficult storms, we can expect to start seeing them the further we get. Any questions on that? So that's kind of the basics of where we're at with flooding. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some 4 different things that are related to flooding that I think will be relevant to all of you. So we'll start with chemical considerations during the flood. So this is something that came up in the Extension office. We also have a hazardous waste specialist. So folks that know Calliope Chute, she and I have had conversations about how we can work together. And so this is one of the things when Calliope works on hazardous waste, we've seen some issues with hazardous waste and floods. Specifically last January again, in Provincetown, when there was so much flooding in Provincetown, there were some issues in Provincetown with hazardous waste getting into the water. And there are a lot of things that people don't necessarily think about. I mean, I hadn't really thought about what's in there. It's what's in people's homes, what's in regular businesses. I hadn't thought about that at all. Hopefully you guys are aware of that since you're going into those homes. But this is just a good idea, a list of things to keep in mind that might be in there and might be in the water. This is some management tips for folks that might have more chemicals. So this was in Chatham Marina. So there may be specific businesses that have more chemicals. I don't know if you guys interact with these businesses at all. Do you? I mean, someone? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Well, not in Chatham, but
right. In Falmouth. All right. In Falmouth specifically. So these just might be things to talk to those businesses about. Okay, what chemicals do you have? Where are they? What happens if they interact with water? How should they be stored? Do you have a handle on how you should store them? So these are just some things to keep in mind. I am not an expert on the chemical waste side of things, or on the chemical side of things, but this has been put together in collaboration with some other experts on chemical issues. So things for you guys to be aware of. The risk of contaminated floodwaters. So this has happened every time we have a flood. we get contaminated floodwaters. So we've got gas stations that go under and leak all kinds of gas, mostly here. Whenever a car gets submerged, oil, gas, all kinds of good things are leaking out. This was a chemical plant during Hurricane Harvey in Houston. They lost all of their power, and then their refrigerated chemicals, the chemicals that had to be refrigerated, didn't have any refrigeration. They exploded, and there are all kinds of issues around that. That was a whole other issue related to Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And that was certainly of concern. If they had sent firemen in there to deal with that, that would have been a big concern. So even if you aren't, if you're not going in to deal with a fire specifically, if you're just dealing with rescues, there's all kinds of stuff in that water that you might be exposed to that you might not think about. Whether it is chemicals, which are certainly of concern, it could be debris that's got nails sticking out of it, and as soon as it hits your leg and you've got an open wound, and then things get into that. There are a lot of animal carcasses in floodwaters, so there are all kinds of dead things and really gross things floating around in there that, especially if you get an open wound, is a concern. After Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the first responders had major issues with infections because of getting open wounds and all of the stuff that was in water, so in the floodwater. So it's something to be aware of. In terms of drinking water, there is a big concern for drinking water, so this may be something if you guys have to help bring in water to the community because the drinking water source is contaminated. There can be a pipe breach that the floodwaters have broken a pipe. There could also be a lack of electricity and functioning sanitation systems at the drinking water facility. So if that happens, and it has happened in other places, then fresh water needs to be brought in. And that would likely fall to you guys to do that. There are also some environmental concerns, just the aquifer, vegetation, wildlife. If any of these chemicals get out, that there will be some exposure to those things. There's also another component to this, the debris after the storm. So once the floodwaters have receded, there's then also a lot of debris that has to be dealt with and set aside, hopefully, so that everybody can get through the roads again. But that's a whole other issue and a whole presentation in and of itself. Some opportunities for planning for chemical safety and flooding. There's the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MEP Program. You guys have gone through that. Did anybody participate in that process? Kim did? All right. So basically what that is there's a workshop that stakeholders in the town went through. You decide what your hazards are, what's vulnerable, and basically what you want to plan for. And then once you identify your priority actions, the state will then provide funding to implement those things. So, and those things can be changed moving forward. So what you've done to start, the first time around, whatever you put as your priority actions, they don't have to stay the same. So if this is something that you feel is important for the town to consider, then you can change your priority actions so that you can then get funding to implement something like this. Hazard mitigation plans, the same thing, identifying vulnerabilities and risks, and you can get funding to implement those as well, except those are a federal requirement, and it's a little bit harder to get that money, so the state money is a bit more accessible. And then there's also the community rating system, which I'm going to talk more about coming up, but that is a program that the town of Falmouth is working to get into, and the basics are it helps to save money on flood insurance for everyone in the town. Some possible action items. So if you prohibit storage of hazardous waste in the floodplain, you get credit for that in the community rating system, and you also lower the risk of having any of those chemical issues in floodwaters. Investing in barriers for high-risk structures, that would be what the businesses do. And then outreach, helping businesses and homeowners identify chemicals. So Kim, I don't know if that would be something that would be appropriate at the fair every year. Maybe Calliope could do that. Yeah. Encouraging storage in safe places, and then there's also, this is for businesses if you do interact with them. OTA is the Office of Technical Assistance, and they're a state-built or a state entity, and they will go into a business and they keep it completely confidential. So even if you fear that maybe you're not doing everything right, that they don't care. They just want to help you do things correctly and figure out the best way to do it. So if you do know of any businesses that do work a lot with chemicals and could benefit from making sure that they are safely stored and managed, the Office of Technical Assistance is available. Any questions on chemicals and flooding? Okay, so now we're going to move on to something else. This is something that is a joint project at the county. So my office, the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, Cape Cod Commission, and the Regional Emergency Planning Committee all got a joint grant from the Seaport Economic Council to pursue what's called the Storm Tide Pathways Project. And this is something that the Center for Coastal Studies started and did some pilots of in Provincetown, Truro, and Nantucket. And then we got funding to do it on Cape Cod Bay. So it is not happening in Falmouth right now, but I do want to give you guys a heads up of what it is because it's extremely useful. And we are looking for funding to bring it to the south side. Right now we're focusing on, we have funding, we're just waiting for one last piece to get into place to do around Cape Cod Hospital in Hyannis and Yarmouth. And then our next plan would be to do Falmouth once we find the funding. So keep that in mind if you run into anything that might be useful in terms of grants. So what this is, so this is a normal flood insurance rate map. So basically flood map from FEMA. This is what FEMA gives us. So we can see there are different flood zones. We can see how high the flooding is going to be. That's what the elevation is. The different colors are the different flood zones. But we don't know how water gets, say, over there. It looks like it's probably just going to flow right that way, but it doesn't. So, so what we're going to find out from this project is exactly how water gets from point A to point B. So right now we know the total extent. What we want to know is how it gets there. So that is a graphic of what the storm tide pathways look like eventually, to walk you through a little bit. So these are some slides from the Center for Coastal Studies to show you, to visualize how to actually do this. So they start with LiDAR, so really good elevation data, and then they overlay satellite imagery over it, and they have some really advanced elevation and mapping technology that they have for their seafloor mapping program that they've been able to apply to the land for this project. So they start, this is just, this is mean low water, lower low water, and this is going to go over the satellite image that is overlaid over elevation. So we start with, they just slowly increase the water level. So this is if a storm was coming. So this is basically storm surge increasing, and you can see up in the top corner there how much water we've got tied to mean lower low water. So we're about to see how the water moves through into Provincetown. So, all right. So now we have this line right here. So that's the area that we're going to be focusing on for how water moves into the community. So they take a profile, an elevation profile. So this is if they took the elevation right along this line and then turned it sideways so that we can see what the elevation is. And all right, so you can see point A connected to point A there, and then B is on the other end. All right, so this is if we raise the water level enough to breach this first point in elevation. What happens then? So once we reach there and exceed that, that area floods. And then once the tide rises even more, that whole area floods. And the only way that water gets over there is to go through this storm tide pathway. So this is really useful, especially in more urban areas, but there are a lot of really interesting things coming out of this project on the bay side. Okay, and now just to demonstrate it further, so hopefully this video in the next slide is going to work. Keep an eye on the flower pot. So there's the flower pot. This is from the January 2018, January 4th, 2018 storm, the one that set the storm of record. So that is looking down. So that was looking here, the water was coming right through here as predicted, and then flowing down the road as predicted, and you could see the flower pot was right there that moved across the way. And actually we just did a presentation on this yesterday, and they found another video that someone had posted from that storm that shows perfectly how the water turned around that corner and flowed down the street. So it did exactly what this method, what this modeling and mapping predicted it would do. So it is really useful. It has been verified already. It can be used for all kinds of different things. I'll show you, before I get into that, to show you what the end product is going to look like. So once we're done with this, the data will be publicly accessible, and we'll be doing trainings with every town on how to use it. So these dots are tied into mean low or low water. So they're tied to, if you have a tide gauge, which they have been adding to the communities, then you'll be able to see real time, okay, the tide is at this level, so what does that mean in our community? So the yellow dots, you can see when the tide gets to between 13 and 13.9 feet, you're going to have a problem at the yellow points. Once it gets to 15 to 15.9, then the red points start to go. So you can kind of predict based on what the National Weather Service tells us to expect from the storm surge, how much storm surge to expect. You can kind of see what parts of your community are going to be in trouble. And then you can also take action before that to hopefully prevent that, or at the very least be prepared for it. And in some cases, you guys know this already. If you've been in this community for a long time, you know where the problems are. But if you move on, if other people come in, this is a great way to document those problem areas so that everybody is aware of what the issues are. And we were at again, when we gave this presentation yesterday, MEMA was there, and MEMA funded one of these projects, the one for the hospital, and they're very interested in continuing to use this, and said that if this were used in applications to get grants from them, that they would be more likely to fund something. It would be a stronger application if it had this behind it. So there's a lot of use to it. What we're also doing is tying it into the National Weather Service. So when the National Weather Service says to predict, when they predict minor, moderate, or major flooding, that doesn't really mean anything to a normal person. But what we can do is tie that into these storm tide pathways, each point. And so we know, at what tide level they're going to flood. And so they have tied the colors to the National Weather Service system. So minor flooding is yellow, so each of the yellow points will flood if we have minor flooding. Moderate is orange, they will flood if we have moderate flooding, and major red. So you can see based on the National Weather Service predictions, so they will give storm surge estimates, and then they'll give these general flooding categories as well. So this just makes it a lot easier to translate what the National Weather Service is telling us and put that on the ground in our communities to see exactly what that means. So this is in progress to work with the National Weather Service to get this going for all of the communities where this is done. So the uses, so future infrastructure investments. If you've got one area that tends to flood all the time, or you can show with the storm tide pathway, if this one place, if we protect this one area, is going to protect an entire huge piece of the community, then there's more justification to put in some sort of infrastructure there, or a temporary flood barrier or something. It's easier to make the justification for the funding to get something if you have this behind it. For emergency response, this will also be able to be used if you have maps of your evacuation routes, or whatever routes, if there are routes to get ambulances through. You'll also know what areas are likely to be flooded and what areas you shouldn't send a truck through, and where you might want to look for an alternative route if that's an option. You guys may know this, I learned this yesterday. So during the 2018 storm, Provincetown lost 2 fire trucks because they sent them through too much salt water and they had to be replaced. So we can avoid that.
We did that in 1991.
All right.
A long time ago.
Right. Oops. We can try to avoid more oops.
Yeah.
Yep. Unless you want to get rid of them. So for planning, this can also be used for coastal flood resilience in general, areas again that you want to put money into. and for hazard mitigation. So it can go into your hazard mitigation plans to help you identify what areas are most at risk and what is most vulnerable. The community rating system, again, I will get to that. You can also get credit for using this in the CRS program, and that translates into savings on flood insurance for your residents, and your residents are really happy about that. It is important to note that the data will be publicly accessible. Again, so this was funded by the Seaport Economic Council, which is a state entity, so they want to make sure that this is, if they are putting money into something, it will be publicly accessible. And they're a little bit concerned because Center for Coastal Studies is a private entity, but that's why it's being routed through the county so that we are the project managers and we have control over the data and the endpoint and help getting that out to the communities. So the communities can use it in any way that they choose, and it will be available on a web-based app to make it easy to use. So you don't have to have GIS to use this. You just have to have the internet, basically. And then hopefully it's something that we can download onto whatever system you use, if there is no internet, if power goes out, whatever, so that you can continue to have access to this. So it's a really great project. And again, we are trying to get it here. We may at some point be looking for support for funding. So if we can get support from first responders, then that would be great. So if you hear from me, please don't delete the email. So we might be looking for letters of support at some point to bring this to Falmouth. Are there any questions on that? All right.
Where do we sign up?
Yeah. Once we find the funding, we definitely will do that. Actually, we were just talking yesterday that we might try going back to the Seaport Economic Council for another round because it has been so successful so far. Have there been any, does anybody know if there have been any Seaport Economic Council funded building projects in town? Studies? Okay.
They gave us money for a town dock in Woods Hole as well.
Yeah? Okay. So one of our approaches to that is thinking, well, if Seaport is putting money into a community, will they also give us money to basically insure it in a way to figure out what's at risk and how to protect it. So, okay, that's good to know. We are looking for that money.
Have they not come up with any MEMA grants that also would fund something like this? I mean, this speaks to all aspects of, pre-hazard mitigation.
Yep. So MEMA's funding comes through FEMA, and there is something in hazard mitigation funding. It's normally that's for specific on the ground projects, and this is a little more abstract than they usually do. But there is an initiative in there called the 5% initiative. That they give 5% of whatever funding comes to the state, 5% can be used for things like this. But the funding is pretty limited, so and that is what we got to do the hospital. So we wanted to focus on the hospital first as a priority area, but then Falmouth would be the next priority. So maybe we could do that again, but because the funding is limited, we have to see how much it will cost to actually do it. And Falmouth, with all of the peninsulas, Falmouth is going to take quite a bit of time. Another piece to this is that Falmouth being on the south side and more at risk from tropical storms, we are likely to see a higher storm surge with tropical storms, which means that when Center for Coastal Studies is on the ground, they go out with GPS units and map these to make sure that the elevations are accurate, and that they have to go further inland because the storm surge is likely to be higher, so it'll just take more time and more money to do it. So I don't know if the HMGP funding that comes through FEMA, through MEMA, will provide enough money to be able to do that, but we've looked at that, and we'll go to them again. We'll go anywhere that we can find the money to do it. Any other questions?
Are you going to switch gears a little bit? Because I actually do.
Yes.
Maybe this even is for Ray too. So you had talked about, you mentioned the phrase temporary flood barrier.
Yep.
And you mentioned that in context of a business. Can you, is a temporary flood barrier an option other than thinking like, Holland, which is underwater, or New Orleans, which is levied like crazy? Is a temporary flood barrier, I don't make sense for like a single occupancy, but is that we look at Woods Hole as being obviously our greatest the known risk of flooding, which is going to happen someday.
Right.
How is a temporary flood barrier something that could be used to protect a geographical area, or is it a target-specific thing?
So what I'm talking about really is a target-specific thing, and really would be for a single home or a single business. There are all kinds of companies out there trying to market these things. The one that the Chatham, I think it's Outermost Marine use, they're basically like Jersey barriers that have plastic over them to protect them. So that is one option. So you're talking more like a hurricane barrier like they have in New Bedford and Providence. That is extremely costly.
And are they effective?
Well, it depends what you mean for effective. So yes, they do. They will keep a certain level of storm surge out. However, the storms typically come with a whole lot of precipitation. So water can't get in, but water also can't get out. So if you've got all kinds of rain, and this happened in Providence with one of the big storms, the barrier was closed, the rain couldn't get out, so the city stayed very flooded for a long time. There are some geographic restrictions, so you kind of need 2 points that are close to connect them. Woodsall doesn't really have that. You also need to see what the elevation is around that. Is the water just going to easily go around and flood another way? So there are a lot of considerations with that. And that certainly, it should be listed as something to investigate. The reality is it's probably not going to be the most effective option because of the size, the engineering required, the expense, and also with sea level rise, how high do you build it? To what level of sea level rise do you try to protect against?
With the use of temporary barriers elsewhere, that anybody's experienced with them, has there ever been an issue where somebody puts you put a temporary flood barrier up around Cape Cod Hospital? Now you've made Cape Cod Hospital's good, but somebody else's problem is worse.
Yes, that is definitely the other concern, and that absolutely happens outside of hurricane barriers. So if you are right outside of the hurricane barrier, you are in a bad place. Yes, so that's another thing that you would want to consider with where you're tying it in geographically, what else is around. Because we just had a presentation on lawsuits and climate change liability, then I'd be really careful about who's outside of that and how you treat those folks. Yeah, so it seems like a great idea to put in a wall to protect a large area, but there are a lot of challenges that go with it. Yeah, good
Thanks.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any others? I am going to switch gears a little bit, so if there's anything else. Okay. All right. So switching gears into flood insurance. So this is my public service announcement, part of the presentation. So just to tell you a little bit about flood insurance, both for your own knowledge and to understand kind of what's going on in the community with flood insurance. So flood insurance is part of the National Flood Insurance Program. So it's a federal program that's operated by FEMA. They deal with mapping, insurance, and regulations. So all of our building code regulations that have to do with how you can build in a floodplain, those all actually come from FEMA through the National Flood Insurance Program. So there are all kinds of things that are tied into the NFIP. The most important piece is the mandatory purchase requirement. So this is for anyone who is located in one of those, if you remember the slide from the beginning with the floodplains and the dark blue, anyone who has a federally backed mortgage in one of those dark blue areas is required to carry flood insurance. So that's why a lot of people have flood insurance, because they have to. One, also because they don't know this. Flooding is not covered by homeowners insurance. That's my big PSA moment. It's not covered by homeowners insurance. Everybody thinks it is. It isn't. You have to have a separate policy for flooding. There's one company that I know of. USAA includes flood in their contents coverage, but nobody else, to my knowledge, covers flood. It is a separate peril. So a lot of people think that they have flood insurance, and then they go to file a claim with their insurance company, and they realize that they don't. And they realize they're not covered for that major loss that they just suffered. And a lot of communities, so a community has to voluntarily participate in the NFIP. You have to opt in, which Falmouth did decades ago. All of the Cape did, because if you don't, then most of your folks in floodplains are not going to have access to mortgages because they don't have access to flood insurance if you don't opt into the program. So that's why towns opt in. When they opt in, they do have to abide by those regulations. But the regulations, specifically the building regulations, those are all built into our state building code now. So there is one town that's near us that has not opted into the NFIP because they don't want to enforce the regulation side of it, but they're already tied into the building code. So it doesn't really matter anymore. But we have opted in, so we enforce all of the regulations, all the insurance is tied to these floodplains that are mapped by FEMA, and we do have access to flood insurance and therefore federally backed mortgages in floodplains. There is private flood insurance available now. It just started in the last couple of years in Massachusetts, but we're still trying to figure out exactly what the coverage looks like, what the availability is, and all kinds of things that it's just so new, it's difficult to really get a good handle on. Just some basics, again, for your own knowledge. Here's what the coverage looks like. So $250,000 for a residential structure, $100,000 content, so that's typically what people have for their homes, up to that level. Commercial or non-residential, you can have up to $500,000 for both contents and structure. There are different deductibles. Something that folks get hung up on a lot here, really all of New England, because we love our basements, because we have cellars. We're a historic area. The coverage in basements is really limited. So if you live in an area that floods and then you get flood insurance and think, okay, I'm covered, that's a great first step, but no, there are limits on basement coverage. Everyone should have flood insurance, or at least should think about it, because any sort of flood damage is only going to be covered by flood insurance. So this is rain, if you've got rain in your basement, or basement damage from rain, of course storm surge. If your neighbor's pool bursts and it goes into your basement and their basement, only flood insurance is going to cover that. If there's a water tower leak and it affects your property, only flood insurance is going to cover that. There are a lot of really weird things with it, but it is something that is worth talking to your insurance agent about and at least considering whether or not you should have that coverage.
So before you go too far though, so you look at this is just curious to me, $250,000 up to structural damage. If your $4 million house gets wiped out by a flood, you get 250 grand back?
You have the option. There are companies that carry excess insurance.
Right.
Yeah. So you would have your first $250,000 with the NFIP, and then you would go Lloyd's in London is usually who covers that. Yep. Elevation certificates I'm not going to cover, but the building department knows all about elevation certificates. And there are some reforms. So right now, just something to be aware of, and this is why the community rating system, which I'll talk about next, is important. Oops, sorry, ignore that Dennis slide. I related this for Dennis before. There are rate increases. So for older homes that were built before the mid-70s, especially for second homes built before the mid-70s, their flood insurance rates are going up 25% a year, which is huge when they start at a couple thousand. And even everyone else, even if they weren't built before then, or even if they're a primary home, rates are going up. So yes, flood insurance is a good thing to have. Yes, it is also expensive. Folks that have to have it are sometimes put in very difficult situations. So that we'll talk about in just a second, how we're dealing with that.
I have a question about that. Imagine a tree going through your house.
Yep.
And the inside gets flooded out because of the rains.
Yep.
So would the tree have to hit two houses?
Yeah, right.
Anyone
So-
really that affects two contiguous properties. How does
Yep.
that work?
So if it were a tree, then the cause of the damage would be the tree, and therefore your homeowner's insurance would cover it.
Okay.
So, but if it's if the initial damage is caused by flooding that covers either two contiguous properties or acres, then it's flood insurance. So this became a huge issue after Hurricane Katrina, because when there was nothing left but a slab, the insurance companies didn't know, did the wind take it, which means homeowners insurance covers it, or did the storm surge take it, which means flood insurance covers it. So there are all kinds of big lawsuits, all kinds of complicated things, and those poor people were stuck in the middle. You may have realized that there's not a whole lot of insurance companies right on Cape Cod. Because we are so close to water, they don't want to run into that issue that happened after Hurricane Katrina. So it can be very difficult to get even homeowners insurance when you are close to the water for that reason. Just some specifics for Falmouth. look, I did the right town this time. So we did get new flood maps in 2014. Everybody on the Cape got new flood maps in 2014. This added 1,500 structures to the floodplain for a total of almost 5,000 for Falmouth. For those 1,500 that were added, that means that if they have a federally backed mortgage, they now have to have flood insurance in order to keep that mortgage.
Were those structures existing before the
those
first
were
survey?
structures,
Or
yes.
things that have been built in the floodplain since the,
They are things that were pre-existing,
Pre-existing.
and then the map changed, the floodplain expanded, and they were included in the floodplain. Ow is right, exactly. Yes. So the average value for those structures is $270,000. A lot of people say, I don't care about flood insurance. I don't care about those people who are right on the water. They're not right on the water. And Falmouth especially, again, with all the peninsulas, the floodplain goes way inland in ways that you wouldn't expect. So these are modest homes. They're not the right on the water $1 million homes. And the total value of structures that was added is almost $350 million. So there's a lot at risk in Falmouth. Just a couple notes on those rate increases. So Barnstable County is in the top 1% of counties in the nation that's struggling with those rate increases because we have so many second homes. So many people's rates are going up so quickly because of that. So there's a lot of effort to try to address that, which will be the next part and the last section here. And then also specifically in Falmouth, 546 policies are increasing at that 25% rate, and that's the highest number on the Cape for any community. So Falmouth has the most homeowners who are struggling with an increase in flood insurance costs. Congratulations.
hallelujah Hatchville, yeah. Appalachian living at its best, yeah.
This is just one demonstration of cost savings and how flood insurance costs get so high. So BFE, it was base flood elevation, so that's the expected level of flooding, and that's how flood insurance rates are determined. That's how, if you're building new, how they figure out how high you're supposed to build. So if you have a house that's below that expected level of flooding, or if this is your first floor and this is your basement, which is what we usually run into, you can have a flood insurance policy of nearly $10,000 a year when you're that far under base flood elevation. If you are right at base flood elevation and you've constructed below that level according to the code, you can have a $1,400 policy every year, which is still painful, but a whole lot better than $10,000. If you build well above base flood elevation, which the building code is now requiring that we do build above that level, your flood insurance rate can be as low as $427. With all other factors equal, comparing these three particular scenarios, that's the difference. So you can see how building above base flood elevation and building to code can be extremely helpful for flood insurance savings. So people can save money on flood insurance by building or retrofitting so that they meet this, or the other way to save money on flood insurance is what's called the community rating system. So my job was created 4 years ago, shortly after the map changes in 2014 went into effect, when we realized so many folks were hurting from these flood insurance rate increases, and some people were being put out of their homes, and not just their second homes, but also their primary homes. So my position was created to help the towns get into this community rating system, which helps the towns improve overall resiliency to flooding and help save money on flood insurance. So the CRS, it's a voluntary program. It's managed within the National Flood Insurance Program, so it's all federal, which is why you need somebody to help all the towns, because it's very complicated and there's all kinds of documentation and bureaucracy to go through. So again, incentivizes that resilience, alleviates those increasing flood insurance costs, and ultimately what we're looking for is it makes the town and the residents safer from flooding. And we know we have all kinds of flood risk everywhere on the Cape, but Falmouth is particularly vulnerable. And I note that it's the town that actually participates. So the county, through me, the towns get assistance from the county, but the town has to actually participate. Somebody within the town is my point person, and the town actually participates. And so in Falmouth, I have 2 point people. We are working on getting into it. It's been a long process. The point people are Bob Shea, the GIS person, and Jennifer McKay, conservation agent. So I work with the two of them to move the town ahead in this process. Where we're at right now, we have submitted the initial application to get FEMA's attention and say we're interested. Unfortunately, FEMA is very understaffed, and they have to come do a review of all of our building in the floodplain and our floodplain work overall to make sure that we've been in basic compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. And that they can't come do for a while. They came and did an initial visit with us. You were there for that, right? So we did an initial visit just to kind of talk about what they'll be looking for from us. And then they will come, it might be even a year from now. Unfortunately, it's a long wait because there's one person for all of New England that does this. Boston is going through it right now, and Boston is taking a whole lot of time. It's great that Boston is doing it, but we are in line, Falmouth is in line, but because of the lack of staff at FEMA, we can only do it so quickly, but we are in line. So how the program works, it's a point system, so you get points for doing certain activities that I'll show you quickly next. And then there are different classes, and then you can see the premium discount that's tied to each of those classes. So on the Cape, usually towns enter at a class 8, so that's a 10% discount. Some are at a class 5, some have opted to stay at a class 5. Brewster, for example, they don't have a lot of policies in the floodplain. It wasn't worth it for staff to put in a lot of effort, so we were able to just map their open space in the floodplain, and that was enough to get them that 5% discount. So that was a good compromise. It's still getting in, but not really using staff time. It was just my time that did that. Right now, we can't go above a 15% discount. That has something to do with the building code. We've been working on it for years to get it corrected between the state and FEMA to let, it's a wind issue. So it's very frustrating that in this flood program, we can't advance, the towns can't advance because of a wind issue. But because FEMA is an all hazards agency, they want all of our wind stuff to be up to snuff too. So that's a state building code issue that we're working on, but just getting to that 15% discount is a big effort and a lot of work. So just getting there is a good starting point. This is the activities, the categories that the activities fall into. So public information, there's a lot of public outreach. There are brochures and things that my office has put together and has been distributed to all of the town halls, so Falmouth does have that. There are mapping and regulations, open space preservation, and the building code are where we get credit here, and we get a lot of credit. We have a really good building code, so at the state level, so we get credit for that. And open space preservation, which Bob has already mapped, that gets us a long way. We've done a really good job with open space preservation in the floodplain on all of the Cape. But that's really important because if there are no structures there, they can't be damaged, no one's going to get hurt, and the National Flood Insurance Program isn't going to have to pay a claim on it. So they want more open space. Warning and response, which is most relevant to you guys. That is something that we can get credit for, and there are things. Do you have a code red or something like that? So you can get credit for that. There are a bunch of things that you can get credit for, but you need a flood emergency plan in order to get that credit. You have to have everything. So if that's something that the town is interested in pursuing, then I'm happy to do that. The storm tide pathways mapping is a critical first step to that. So we have a lot of the work already done for that. And then it would be a map of, okay, once the water gets here, what is the response plan? And the REPC is also interested in assisting any town with that wants to do that. So once the town gets in, and if we're looking for more credit, that could be a really great way to do it and to get you guys to have some documented things. This is where our towns are at. So these are the towns that are in the program now. When my position started 4 years ago, 4 towns were in. Now we have 9 in. And they wouldn't have wanted to do it on their own. It is a big lift. So this was a great idea that the county had. It was not my idea. I just got to fill a position. So we can see that we've got over $400,000 in savings annually. So far in the 4 years that the county has had a regional CRS program, we've saved over $1 million for policyholders on the Cape. So obviously that will continue to increase. Right now, over 3,000 policyholders are benefiting from these discounts. If Falmouth gets in, when Falmouth gets in, even at the lowest level, it's something like 500,000 in savings. So just the town of Falmouth alone would more than double that number from 9 other towns. So there's a huge benefit from the town of Falmouth participating in this program. So we are moving in the right direction, and right now it's FEMA, unfortunately, and them being understaffed that's keeping us from moving forward, but we are working on it. There are a couple of other programs, towns that are applying. So Bourne is just ahead of Falmouth. They've already had their visit with FEMA, and we're just doing some tying up from that. All of the towns are either somewhere in the application process or in the program. Yarmouth and Truro have both expressed interest. Yarmouth will do it. Dennis, we just started. Yarmouth, I have no doubt that they will eventually do it. Truro, I'm not sure if they will or not. I've heard different things from different folks on whether or not they want to participate. But there are fewer folks there that would benefit. So we'll let them figure it out when the time comes. But you can see that most of the Cape is now either in the program or in the application process for the program. Just one final slide here. So this is where we'd be at. Okay, I'm sorry. It's if we get the 15% discount, we'll be at over 500,000. But even if Falmouth just gets the 5% discount, it's half of what all of the other communities are getting together. So we'd have 2,000 policyholders. There's a weird way how they split up once you get beyond that class 9, but 2,000 policyholders would benefit in some way. You can see the average savings range from 130 to 380. So again, that's per policy, so that's the money that goes back into folks' pockets. The city of Virginia Beach did a study on this because they put a lot of time into figuring out whether or not this program was worth it for them. And they did an economic study showing that half of the savings got reinvested in the community. So, and they also have a lot of second homeowners. So a lot of that money gets reinvested back into this community. It's not being taken out. So even though the town doesn't get any direct savings from it, there are reinvestments of those savings back into the town of Falmouth. So we can see that no matter what level the town of Falmouth gets in at, there are significant savings and a significant number of policyholders that benefit from that discount. And with that, I am done. Any other questions?
That was great information.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
We want in.
Yeah. You know, one Category 3 storm and when
Yep.
born in Sandwich going to Cape Cod Bay. Now we're on the Cape Cod Bay side. So, yeah. Anything else? I don't really have anything else. We do want to talk about the tornado that touched down there, went right down the middle of Route 28, didn't touch Falmouth, and then touched down Cape. But go ahead, Kim.
I just wanted to give a summary on our emergency preparedness and fire prevention fair. It took place this past Saturday at the rec center, and although it was rough to compete with an Indian summer day in the area of 76 degrees in the middle of September, but we fared pretty well because we had a decent amount of participants and visitors, and we had about 150 visitors, numbers down a little bit from years past, but that's understandable. They were still out in droves, and based on the comments that we heard, they were still very pleased with the information that was available to them. Many people not expecting as much information as we had to share. So just some numbers also, 70 visitors filled out our passports, which mean that they needed to visit at least 25 of our approximate 65 or 70 informational tables. A lot of the passports that I saw were completely filled with their stickers, so that's awesome. And we had 55 visitors participate in our raffle, so we were very pleased to see that as well, and we consider it a great success.
Yeah, the only thing I heard in this for you, Craig, Kathy Felder, who's one of the nurses, was there, mentioned about some file of life stuff for next year.
Okay.
That's all. No, it was smashing success. Yeah, no, really, that's all I got. I mean, the tornado didn't really think. We don't have to talk about the tornado because it went right over the top of us. But it was, that was kind of an eye-opening day. Kim and I were actually in Plymouth in their emergency operations center at a hurricane preparedness. And all of a sudden, everybody's phone in the room just went crazy, and actually a couple people had to get up and leave. And that was interesting. It's an interesting thing to touch on, and it's something that maybe that we inside here can start, maybe put that on the radar screen to focus on a little bit, because the chances of it ever happening are pretty rare. But now that's, you know, when you looked at a National Weather Service map that showed a water spout in Woods Hole, a water spout basically off the mouth of Falmouth Harbor, and then that cell just pretty much right down Route 28 through T-Ticket and across Mashpee and microburst in Mashpee, and then the touchdown is a little bit farther down the Cape. So it's a video out there, if you haven't seen it, the roof coming off a hotel in Yarmouth, and it was crazy stuff. So it's something we may want to sort of start putting on the radar screen. So, but anybody else? Good and welfare?
Just one last mention, it's at the bottom of your agenda. Next month's meeting
Yes, very good, yes.
is, our guest speaker is Chief Brian Mortiari. He is the fire chief from Lawrence, and he will be bringing a fabulous presentation to us on lessons learned from last year's Merrimack gas explosions.
We may put a little, you know, this, I think it's gonna be pretty popular. You may wanna get here early. We may actually take the tables out. We're expecting that might be a pretty good crowd, but I have not heard, I have not heard him speak, but I heard people relate to the situation that they had in the Merrimack Valley, and it should be pretty fascinating. So, but it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So make
Apparently
sure you
his
know it.
presentation, he has presented it so that you can earn continuing ed
Credit for it.
credits for,
They'll
is it
definitely-
EMS, just
yeah.
EMS?
Yes, I think just emails.
Yeah.
But yeah, it should be pretty interesting. But please make the note to change the time. So, that's it. See you next one. Thank you. Thank you.